Okay, hi everybody and welcome back to Nations and Nationalism. So in this lecture we're going to cover the road to the final solution to Auschwitz basically. This is going to include quite a lot of very disturbing and unpleasant material, so I just thought I'd let you know in advance what to expect. So in the summer of 1941, Hitler met with Heinrich Himmler. In this undocumented meeting, Hitler authorised his lieutenant to produce a comprehensive plan to solve the so-called Jewish question, once and for all. Precisely what was said in this meeting, we don't really know. It's likely that Hitler was vague in his instructions, and did not inquire of Himmler how best he thought this solution could be achieved. Hitler had long been aware that much of his personal power stemmed from his personal charisma. It would not do to allow his name or person to be associated with the destruction of Europe's Jews. As such, his formal involvement with the destruction of the Third Reich's racial enemies was never documented. His method of achieving his goals was informal instruction through his subordinates. Nevertheless, soon after this meeting, Himmler summoned his own subordinate, a man called Adolf Eichmann, to his presence. In 1960, after his arrest and delivery to Israel, Eichmann told an interrogator what Hitler had told him. Eichmann claimed that, after a short speech, Himmler had said, "The Führer has ordered the physical extermination of the Jews." In a similar fashion, Himmler summoned Rudolf Hess, or Hoss even, to a meeting in the same summer of 1941, and Hoss is on the right. In June 1940, Hoss was a lieutenant commander in the SS and a commandant of a prison camp in West Poland. The camp, which originally housed 700 individuals, mainly Polish POWs, intellectuals and peasants, was Hoss's personal project. He had previously served at Dachau and Sachsenhausen and had been unimpressed by the inefficiency of their operation. He was determined to do things differently, and he set about building a major slave labour camp. That camp was Auschwitz. Clearly, Himmler was impressed by Hoss's progress. In their 1941 meeting, Himmler told Hoss, "The Führer has ordered that the Jewish question be solved once and for all, and we, the SS, are to implement the order. The existing extermination centre in the East are not in a position to carry out the large actions we are anticipating. I have therefore earmarked Auschwitz for this purpose." So, from these first informal meetings, the final plan to exterminate the Jews of Europe began. These meetings and the events which they set in motion were soon followed in January 1942 with the Wannsee Conference, a meeting of 15 senior Nazi officials to formalise a programme of annihilation. The conference was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, Himmler's second-in-command of the SS, to convene the conference. While the minutes of this meeting survive, Heydrich ordered that they be penned in euphemistic language, but the purpose of the meeting was clear: to outline the mass murder in the various occupied territories and to ensure that Nazi officials occupied Europe would share the bureaucratic burden and the responsibility for the programme. In this lecture we will consider the radicalisation of Nazi racial policy from 1941 to the establishment and operation of the death camps, and with a particular emphasis on Auschwitz-Birkenau II. After that we will briefly consider the various schools of historical thought which have emerged regarding the Holocaust, its origins and its course. In 1941 and 1942 the Nazis had already been experimenting with various methods of extermination. These included the creation of slave labour camps in which large numbers of the Nazis' racial and political enemies could slowly be worked and starved to death. Following the invasion of the Soviet Union in July 1941, the Wehrmacht and the SS, following close behind, had also been ordered to hunt and exterminate Jews en masse. As such, SS Einsatzgruppen's paramilitary death squads, who followed behind the Wehrmacht's front lines, began exterminating Jews from the outset of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This initially was limited to males, but within a matter of weeks had extended to women and children. By October 1941, Einsatzgruppen A reported that it had successfully exterminated 125,000 Jews. In late November, an order given by the Heer, the army of the Wehrmacht, issued the following order. Order number 24 on the 24th of November 1941. As already has been ordered, the Jews have to vanish from the flat country and the gypsies have to be annihilated too. The carrying out of larger Jewish actions is not the task of divisional units. When smaller or larger groups of Jews are met in the flat country, they can be liquidated by divisional units or massed in the ghettos near bigger villages designated for that purpose, where they can be handed over to civilian authority or the SD. Indeed, the order to begin the extermination of the Jews was given at least by the 31st of July 1941. Hermann Goering, who was in charge of the Luftwaffe, either directly or on the instructions of Himmler or Hitler, ordered Reinhard Heydrich to begin the total solution to the Jewish question. Mass shootings were not confined merely to the Jewish communities on the periphery of the newly opened Eastern Front. As you will recall, Jews unfortunate enough to come under control of the Third Reich, including in places like France, were rounded up into ghettos, which were, of course, sites of death in their own right. However, German officials regularly inspected the inhabitants of ghettos, sorting those who could work from those who could not. In many documented instances, those in the larger category, or the latter category, were marched from the ghettos where they were shot en masse. For instance, a ghetto was founded in Riga, today the capital city of Latvia, in 1941, in which 19,000 women and children were interned and a further 11,000 men. A month later, 25,000 were marched from the ghetto to their deaths. The remaining Jews were sent to Germany to work as forced labourers. One of the problems the SS soon found was that mass exterminations had a negative impact on the well-being of those conducting the liquidation programme. The scale of the programme demanded by Himmler placed a considerable strain on those conducting the killings, poor them. The act of mass shooting unarmed men, women and children proved problematic, as Rudolf Höss, the senior SS officer in charge of Auschwitz-Birkenau, made clear. I always shuddered at the prospects of carrying out exterminations by shooting, when I thought of the vast numbers concerned and the women and children. He went on to add that the thought of continued prospects of wading through blood drove some of his men to suicide, while most had to rely on the fortifying influence of alcohol to carry out the grisly orders. Clearly another solution was required. Nevertheless, in spite of the tribulations caused by mass shootings, in the Ukraine alone, nearly 500,000 people were murdered in this manner by the end of 1941. The solution to the problem soon came available. In October 1939, Hitler signed an order, the infamous Action T4 programme, which permitted the forced euthanasia of patients deemed to suffer from ailments considered incurable, so they might be granted the mercy of death after a definitive diagnosis. The means developed to grant this mercy death included the prescription of lethal doses of medications and other similar means, but soon also extended to the gassing of patients. The T4 programme was formally terminated in 1941 following its denunciation by religious figures, which left specialists temporarily unemployed. These specialists in killing were soon sent to the East to apply their newly developed techniques to the liquidation of Jews in the ghettos and the concentration camps of Eastern Europe. In addition to some early experiments with gas chambers, the result was the mobile gas van. Prisoners were placed into the van. 3 vans at Chelmno could accommodate 50 victims each, and they were driven into the nearby woods, all the while subjecting them to lethal doses of deadly fumes. And this is particularly unpleasant. Of course, the gas vans were not necessarily always efficient. Mothers of infants were sometimes able to wrap their babies sufficiently tightly that they were not exposed to deadly quantities of the gas. The SS guards would smash their heads against nearby trees. The bodies were then dumped in mass graves in the woods, and the cycle began anew. Despite the fragmentary pieces of evidence that we have and which have emerged, such as Himmler's cryptic instructions to Reinhard Heydrich and Rudolf Höss, that Hitler had ordered the final solution to the Jewish question, the precise point at which Hitler instructed the annihilation of Europe's Jews has proven elusive. Nevertheless, by November 1941, it is clear that plans had become genocidal in scope. In a press conference, Alfred Rosenberg, another one of Hitler's chief lieutenants, stated that the acts of murder in the East were aimed at the biological extermination of the whole of Jewry in Europe, further confirming the point in a lecture given to senior party figures, police officials and others at the German Academy. Joseph Goebbels said, "Sympathy or even regret is wholly out of place. World Jewry, in unleashing this war, made a completely false assessment of the forces at its disposal. It is now suffering a gradual process of annihilation that it intended for us, and that it would without question have carried out had it the power to do so. It is now perishing as a result of Jewry's own law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Nevertheless, despite the new developments in the mechanisation of murder and clear acceptance of genocidal policy among the most senior ranks of the Nazi hierarchy, progress continued to develop slowly. By August 1942, it was only in Serbia where the leading SS officer could boast to have completely solved the Jewish question. So, of course, a euphemism for having murdered all the Jews of Serbia. Again, it became clear that another new solution to the Jewish problem would be required. The problems were not merely those related to the impact of mass killing on those charged with the actual act of genocide. The problem was inherently one of practicality and of logistics. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, though in complete agreement regarding the need to liquidate the Jews under his control, was clearly somewhat troubled by the difficulty and scale of the task at hand. "We can't shoot these 3.5 million Jews," he complained. "We can't poison them." However, he did reassure his staff officers that they would be able to take measures that somehow lead to their successful annihilation, namely in connection with large-scale measures that are to be discussed from the Reich. So in other words, he knew that plans were afoot. Those discussions were held on the 20th of January 1942 at the Wannsee Villa in the suburbs of Berlin, and we've already been over the Wannsee Conference. Chaired by none other than Reinhard Heydrich, the object of the conference was of course to gather together senior Nazi officials and administrators to arrange for the transport of occupied Europe's Jews to Poland, where they could be exterminated together. As in the case of the Vans, the route to mass liquidation of those the Nazis deemed to be Untermensch, subhuman, and most specifically Jews in the occupied zone, was poison gas. Rather than utilising gas vans, whole new apparatus, the gas chamber and incinerator, were to become a primary means of industrialising genocide. Over the course of the war, 6 death camps were established in Poland, and a further 2 were established in Belarus and Serbia respectively. At this point, it is worthwhile considering the bureaucratic mechanism of the camps themselves to establish the fairly ad hoc nature in which they were constructed, a point that we will return to later in this lecture. For example, let's take the largest of the camps, Auschwitz. The site was first selected in April 1940 to house political prisoners, and Rudolf Höss was appointed to oversee its construction, expansion and operations. Over the next 2 months, the first prisoners of the camp began to arrive. The camp's inmate population quickly began to swell as Poles, particularly members of the underground resistance, were rounded up and interned. By the end of 1940, the camp had 11,000 inmates, most of them Poles. Himmler was at that time invested in the idea of Germanification. Auschwitz was located in a region which had, until comparatively recently, been in Germany. Himmler's aims was to restore the region to its Germanic roots, and he went about the process of attempting to ethnically cleanse and deport the local inhabitants and encourage the migration of ethnic Germans to the area. In order to facilitate this process, the initial camp was built as a concentration camp designed to terrorise the local population. Following the invasion, however, of the Soviet Union, these plans began to change, and Himmler saw new areas of opportunity for the site, and work began on the construction of a second camp, Auschwitz II-Birkenau, in October. The plan to house as many as 125,000 inmates, captured soldiers of the Red Army, some 10,000 Soviet POWs, were initially transferred to the camp, and within 6 months the majority of these individuals had perished. Less than 1,000 had survived. Those who remained were transferred to Birkenau, where they soon too perished. Given the high mortality rate in the camp, it will come as no surprise that it came complete with mortuaries and incinerators to deal with the sheer scale of corpses. This would prove to be important later on. While all this was going on in 1940 and 1941, the radicalisation of Nazi racial policy had been ongoing, so as discussed earlier in this lecture. The change in policy resulted in the camp being redesignated as an extermination site in March 1942. In the same period, the practice of tattooing prisoners was introduced. Also in early 1942, the first loads of Jews began to arrive, shipped from Slovakia at Auschwitz. Himmler was still bent on Germanifying the region and set up links with chemical giant IG Farben to build synthetic rubber plants at the area. The prisoners in the camp were to act as slave labour to facilitate this work by IG Farben. However, the Slovak government, sweetening the deal with a cash payment, persuaded Himmler to admit Jews into the Auschwitz camp who were unfit for labour. With the arrival of these inmates who could perform no function sufficiently important to keep them alive, Himmler sent the SS construction chief, Hans Kammler, to the camp in May 1942. Kammler soon ordered the retrofitting of a cottage on the site into a gas chamber, which was redesignated Bunker 1, or the Red Bunker. By July 1942, Jewish arrivals at the camp, those individuals deemed unfit for work, were murdered in the bunker. Killing had, of course, already been common practice at Auschwitz. However, the path towards mechanised murder on an industrial scale had proceeded a notch further. Nevertheless, at that time, the camp still maintained the primary function that Himmler had originally assigned to it, the Germanification of the region. The plans Himmler had in mind for the camp when he was given authority over the German settlement of Russia. So this was the Germanification of the region around Auschwitz, and Himmler soon lost interest in this, and instead its secondary function, the systematic killing of Jews, became its key priority. Once again, the SS architects began work at the camp. The result was Crematorium II, or Crema II. Crema II underwent initial testing in March 1943 and was soon placed into full operation. The purpose of the building was to provide a facility in which individuals shipped to the camps could be murdered and promptly incinerated. A retrofitted mortuary, Crema II, operated via the herding of inmates into an underground gas chamber. Canisters of Zyklon B, a cyanide pesticide, were dropped into the gas chamber, which would kill the inmates inside the chamber. Sonderkommandos, Jews who had been selected for the grisly task of manhandling the cadavers, dragged the victims from the gas chamber into a large elevator which led to the furnaces. On its construction, the facility was capable of burning a total of 1,440 bodies each day. However, the decision taken to burn more cadavers than the facility was specified to handle, and the electrical system soon caught fire. At the same time that Crema II was being constructed, so were three other facilities, Cremas 3, 4 and 5. Crema 3 was designed at the same time as Crema 2 and was built to the exact same specifications as its sister facility. Crema 4 and Crema 5, on the other hand, were purpose-built, so they weren't the mortuaries. While Crema 2 was under repair, shipments of Jews continued to arrive, and Crema 4 was opened prematurely without testing to deal with this bottleneck. After 2 weeks, the untested furnace cracked and was taken out of commission for a month while repairs were undertaken. Despite the breakdowns in the first 2 months of the system, the number of individuals murdered was vast, some 37,000. The opening of Crema 3 in June further added to the official capacity of those who could be liquidated each day, which rose to approximately 4,500. In all, historians estimate that 1.1 million people were murdered in the Auschwitz camps. During this lecture and the last, we considered the origins of the Holocaust and examined the gradual radicalisation of Nazi racial policy until it reached full genocidal proportions, as we discussed in this lecture. But further still, it was both mechanised and industrialised. So how have historians interpreted these events? The origins of the discussions date back to the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and the war crimes tribunals initiated by the various Allied powers. Prosecutors constructed a case which alleged that the plans to kill and liquidate the Jewish population of Europe were long-term and could be traced back as far as 1919, with the foundation of the Nazi Party itself. The general thesis, known as the intentionalist school, held that the overarching ideology of the Nazis from its inception incorporated a genocidal component, and that leading Nazis had always intended, if they were to ever achieve power, to destroy the Jews of Europe. This perspective gained considerable traction over the course of the early post-war period, and by the 1970s had become a clear school of thought. For instance, in 1975, Lucy Davidovits published her book, The War Against the Jews. In this highly respected book, Davidovits traced the origins of the final solution to Hitler's experiences in the First World War, specifically the time in which he was hospitalised in the Passwalk Hospital in 1918. By the time he penned Mein Kampf, Hitler was, in Davidovits' view, already utilising the language which laid the blueprints for the invasion of the Soviet Union and the destruction of Europe's Jews. She further contended that Hitler had a long-range plan to implement his ideological desire to destroy. Similarly, John Totland, the author of a 1976 biography of Hitler, also found cause to assert that Hitler had, by 1919, begun to advocate the mass extermination of European Jewry, and developed a clear political programme to do so. In Germany, historians had also reached similar conclusions. Andreas Hillgruber wrote in 1967 the following: "The conquest of European Russia, the cornerstone of the continental European phase of his programme, was, thus for Hitler, inextricably linked with the extermination of these bacilli, the Jews. In his conception, they had gained dominance over Russia with the Bolshevik regime. Russia, therefore, became a centre from which a global danger radiated, particularly threatening the Aryan race and its German core. To Hitler, Bolshevism meant the consummate rule of Jewry, while democracy, as it had developed in Western Europe and Weimar Germany, represented a preliminary stage of Bolshevism. Since the Jews there won a leading, if not yet dominant influence, this racist component of Hitler's thought was so closely interwoven with the central political element of his programme, the conquest of European Russia, that Russia's defeat and the extermination of the Jews were, in theory as later in practice, inseparable for him. To the aim of the expansion per se, however, Hitler gave not racial but political, strategic, economic and demographic underpinnings." So in other words, according to Hillgruber, this had always been the plan. Another historian, Joachim Fest, drew parallels between the gassings of the Jews in the Second World War with Hitler's own experience of being gassed in the First World War. Fest points to Mein Kampf, in which Hitler contended that had several thousand Jews been gassed at the beginning of that conflict, as many as 1 million German troops would have survived. Perhaps best summarising the view of the intentionalist school was Klaus Hilbrand, who argued in 1979 that fundamental to National Socialist genocide was Hitler's race dogma. Hitler's programmatic ideas about the destruction of the Jews and the racial domination have still to be rated as primary and causative, as both motive and aim, as an intention and goal of the Jewish policy of the Third Reich. Clearly then, at the centre of the intentionalist school, 4 key themes emerge. First, that Hitler was the architect of Nazi policy. The role of his lieutenants in the Holocaust was one of facilitating the wishes of their master. Second, that Hitler had reached his views not merely on Jews early, but had arrived at the conclusion that their physical extermination was not only a desirable policy, but a necessary one. Third, that Nazi policy regarding the Jewish question proceeded along the predetermined ideological grooves that Hitler had already envisioned for a long time. And fourth, that Hitler had sufficient power within the Third Reich to command with absolute authority the course of events which would take place under and in the name of the regime which he headed. So the intellectual space occupied with the intentionalist school is also closely linked to other debates regarding the dynamics of power within the Third Reich, namely the role of Hitler within the regime and the extent of his own personal power. Did Hitler command complete or approaching complete dictatorial power within the Third Reich? And can the Third Reich be deemed a totalitarian state? Alternatively, was Hitler as much a functionary and facilitator of events which were ultimately belonged or beyond his control? So this latter line of argument, which places Hitler as a prisoner to those forces, is in some ways easily caricatured, as in some ways as making light of the evil of Hitler's pathologies and actions. However, such a characterization is actually rather misleading. Those historians who argue against the intentionalist school do not, for example, deny or seek to reduce the culpability of Hitler in regards to the Holocaust. Instead, they seek to expand the list of guilty historical actors and forces by understanding the mechanisms and structures of the Third Reich and of Nazism. Understandably, chief among those historians who deem Hitler's power to have been approaching absolute were some of those who penned biographies of his life. Joachim Fest, the author of the first major biography of Hitler through the medium of German, was unflinchingly sure of Hitler's command over the Third Reich. The view of Hitler's power as absolute is perhaps best summarized by the American historian Norman Rich, who contended in his work on Hitler's war aims that the point cannot be stressed too strongly. Hitler was master in the Third Reich. However, not all historians of the immediate post-war years before the 1960s and the 1970s at least shared this view. So A.J.P. Taylor, the famous or perhaps infamous historian of interwar diplomacy and international affairs, argued that Hitler, at least in terms of foreign policy, simply continued in the same vein as his predecessors had done in the 19th century. He summarised his view in the following terms: his foreign policy essentially reflected the circumstances of time. Not entirely dissimilar sentiments were also shared by Alan Bullock, the author of one of the first major biographies of Hitler in the English language, Hitler, A Study in Tyranny, in which he presented Hitler as a career opportunist whose rise to power and actions were again dictated by circumstance. By the 1960s and 1970s, however, rather more sophisticated critiques of the Third Reich had begun to emerge which took umbrage with the intentionalist school of thought. Chief among these was Hans Mommsen. Mommsen's view was in many respects diametrically opposed to those of the intentionalists who viewed Hitler as a strong dictator. Instead, Mommsen viewed Hitler as a weak dictator. To quote Mommsen, Hitler was unwilling to take decisions, frequently uncertain, exclusively concerned with upholding his prestige and personal authority, influenced in the strongest fashion by his entourage, and in some ways a weak dictator. The basic argument is that Hitler, though central to the Third Reich, his ideological obsessions being the driving force in shaping Nazism and Nazi policy, his will did not exist in a vacuum. His lieutenants, and indeed the wider socio-political and economic forces at work in Germany and beyond, influenced his views and set the boundaries of what was and what was not possible at various different stages. Martin Brosat's 1969 work, for example, perhaps misleadingly titled The Hitler State, was one of the most important works to make such an argument. Brosat and Mommsen soon were followed by other historians, notably Raoul Hilberg and Christopher Browning, and we'll talk a little bit more about his ideas now. So this latter school, often known as the structuralist or functionalist school, has also reinterpreted the origins of the final solution. If the intentionalist school held that Hitler and his own dominant personality and will, that of a strong dictator, drove Nazi racial policy with the express intent to annihilate the Jews of Europe from the earliest days of the Nazi Party, then the functionalist and structuralist view of the origins of the Holocaust seek to widen the apportionment of blame. So in other words, blame more people. For the early functionalists, such as those as Mommsen, Hitler's role as a driving force of anti-Semitism, and of course both knowledge and approval of the genocidal policy, was qualified by the acknowledgement of forces not necessarily within the Führer's control, not least the inability of Hitler to make firm decisions and willingness to allow subordinates to vie for his personal approval. The increasingly radical, though indefinite, anti-Semitism in his pronouncements and in his speeches and in private provided a broad tapestry for subordinates to pursue their own increasingly radical agendas in order to win his favour, so they attempted to outdo each other in their extremism to gain Hitler's approval. This went as far as the rejection that Hitler ever gave a specific order to initiate the Holocaust. Rather, the radicalisation of policy, incremental as it was, led to the policy's gradual development, and no specific order was given, and indeed nor was it necessary. Hitler simply approved of any increasing radicalisation. One of the most interesting theses proposed, that of Christopher Browning, took issue with several other functionalist historians. A key thesis has been that the origins of the final solution lay in defeat. The turning the tide of war in Europe resulted in the final escalation of the murderous anti-Semitic policy into outright genocide. So a previous plan to defeat the Soviet Union and then expel Europe's Jews to starve to death in the desolate regions of the Soviet Union became impossible with the defeat of the Wehrmacht outside the gates of Moscow in 1941. A new solution, the industrial method of extermination, was required. Browning, himself also a structuralist and functionalist, though of a rather less pronounced in many respects, has overturned this thesis. Instead, Browning argues that the move towards industrialised genocide was not the product of defeat in 1941, but the euphoria of the victories scored by the Wehrmacht in the early summer of that year. The decision made by Hitler and intimated to his subordinates, most likely Himmler, came, according to Browning, in July 1941. By October, the plans to exterminate the Jews were already underway, and previous policies such as the doomed Madagascar plan had been dropped. So the Madagascar plan was the idea that rather than exterminating all the Jews, is that they should simply be shipped to the island of Madagascar. So the original plan was that they should be shipped to Siberia. Obviously, once that became impossible in 1941, then instead the idea was send them to Madagascar. That was no longer possible because obviously Germany was never going to win the war on the seas. So they instead turned towards annihilation. So in terms of the functionalist and structuralist debate, I will leave it to you to consider which view you take.